I'm extremely pleased to begin the first of UpEnd's webinar series with a conversation about the abolition of family policing and Black feminism. A conversation about how we can build a better world, a world without family policing, and a world that understands how to truly care for each other, children, families, and community. As a lifelong student of Black feminist thought, I have long studied and admired the contributions of Black feminist thinkers who have in many ways forged new understandings of society, gender, power, and oppression in ways that are complicated and push us beyond simple solutions that too often leave behind those who are most impacted by exploitation and oppression. At its core, Black feminism is a theory of radical care. Black feminism instructs us to live and act today in ways that push us toward a better future. Black feminism and other theories introduced by Black radical organizing, like reproductive justice, provide us with ideas about how to create a path forward. They ask us not only to consider what systems must be broken for us to thrive, but also give us space to dream for the future, space to dream for a liberated future. So I'm most excited to share this space with all of you who have joined from home and all of you who will watch this later, and our panelists, Chelsea Williams-Diggs and Victoria Copeland. These two women have so much to contribute to this conversation, and I can't wait to learn from them and all of you. So I will stop talking, and I would love to bring out our panelists, Victoria Copeland and Chelsea Williams-Diggs.
Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria. I'm a PhD student at UCLA in social welfare. I also have my MSW from UCLA.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Williams-Diggs. I'm working in the criminal legal system reform space and also working with reproductive justice to imagine feminist futures in all the ways that we can. Thank you for having me.
So let's get right into it. I wanted to start with a definition of Black feminism. So this is not the definition of Black feminism, but it is a definition. Black feminism centers the experiences of Black women, understanding their position and relate it to racism, sexism, class, as well as other social political systems of power. Black women have often been excluded from mainstream feminism because of their gender, because of their race, while excluded from Black liberation movements because of their gender. Black feminism highlights and engages with many aspects of identity that women have, which is significant because it has given women the opportunity to talk about being Black along with their gender, along with their class, and other ways that people experience power and oppression. Despite the prejudice and discrimination they face, Black women were and still continue to be critical to the Black liberation movement and gender equality movements. So I'm wondering from the two of y'all, how does this definition resonate with you? Are there aspects of this definition that you would push back on, expand on, amplify? So I will start with you, Victoria.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, so as you were talking, I was thinking about Jennifer Nash's explanation of Black feminist theory as an anti-captivity project, and one that is really invested in radical conceptions of freedom. So she describes Black feminism as obviously acknowledging and prioritizing Black women as producers of knowledge, political actors, and dreamers. And this is something that is reiterated by, Patricia Hill Collins, Simone Brown, Dorothy Roberts, amongst many others. And so I think this is really important because our society has been so attached to Western logics and language that has created and fueled a lot of stereotypes about Black communities and Black women. And these are not just stereotypes, but there are larger ideological attachments that have real material implications to Black women, Black communities, and Black people in general. The exclusion and visibility, as well as the violence against Black people and Black women, continues even now. And I think that there are so many people and organizations that actively perpetuate it. The child welfare system is no exception. It's one of the main structures of violence, which is unfortunately highly debated in academic spaces, regardless of the experiences that are constantly being vocalized by Black families and Black communities. So That was long-winded, but I think for me, what is so important about a Black feminist praxis or theory is sort of the reiteration and regard for Black life, Black experiences, especially from Black women, and the knowledge of Black people.
Thank you.
Coming out strong. All right. Dropping all the theorist names. So yeah, I mean, I think when I listen to that definition and as I listen to Victoria and as I think about Jennifer Nash and others, thinking about how oftentimes Black feminism is framed in reaction to white feminism or Black liberation, right? And this idea that we're like reacting, and that's not really what Black feminist theorists are doing, and that's not what Black feminist organizers are doing, right? So obviously we're excluded from these spaces, but more and more we're creating our own spaces, right? And really trying to not just say, this is what everyone's doing wrong, but this is what we are doing right. And this is how we're going to move this forward. So I think often back to like, you know, our gender studies courses, hopefully they changed over the years, but, you know, back, you know, when I was like a young freshman learning about feminist theory, it's often kind of like women of color feminism, Black feminism, like at the very end of the syllabus. And it's like, oh yeah, and then they did this because in reaction to all of that. And that's just not true, right? Black women, queer folks, Black queer folks, Black femmes have been kind of theorizing and understanding our realities long before white women organized themselves and called themselves feminist. And even long before Black men decided to, you know, exclude us in certain movements. So I think as much as we talk about the very real exclusion, particularly as it relates to power, media attention, et cetera, I think we have to make sure that we're talking about this project on its own and really allow us to feed into that beyond just reactionary kind of politics or reactionary messaging.
So I love this so much because I think, you know, what has really been something that's drawn me into Black feminism is this idea that people are theorizing all the time, right? And people are creating ways to understand not only themselves, but how they're experiencing systems of power. And I think that Black feminism so perfectly captures, you know, that theorizing. What does it mean to care about people? What does it mean to be in community in ways that I think not only do other theories not do, but I think that Black feminism in particular picks up on the level of knowledge that people are carrying within themselves literally every day as existing in the world, and articulates that to us in ways that help us understand not only what we're facing, but how to move forward. So I appreciate y'all for that. So kind of similar, abolition is often understood and critiqued as something that is focused on tearing structures down, right? And I think a common critique is y'all just want to tear everything down. What happens next? And so Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore has said that abolition is a way of seeing. Abolition makes us ask, when you look, what are you seeing, and what would you rather see? And with that in mind, can you talk about that from the perspective of Black feminism and thinking specifically about how Black feminism and reproductive justice are helping us shape the world that we want to build with children and families and communities? And so, Chelsea, if you want to.
Yeah, I was like, am I first? Yeah, I think just also building out the last thing that you said, right? Thinking about lived experience as knowledge production, right? And as we're theorizing our existence because our existence is enough knowledge in and of itself. So as far as, as far as abolition is seen, right? I think the beautiful thing about reproductive justice and Black feminism is it allows us to connect all of these various systems of oppression to better understand and to better analyze what we're really working with, right? So while abolition does require the destruction of many things, it also is simultaneously saying, how can we build up, right? And how are all the things that we're hoping to abolish going to come together to kind of how can we reimagine this wholly, right? So that's kind of what makes it beautiful, right? And I think, you know, language is so interesting to me, and how we're often using certain phrases where other phrases maybe aren't used as often. But I think of like abolition, revolution, right? So all of these projects that maybe sometimes when you use a different word, it feels like, oh, right, okay, revolution isn't just about taking everything down, it's about creating something new in its entirety. And I think, particularly as I think about like Black feminist abolitionists who've been around for forever, not just since, you know, folks have decided to give you know, the attention, the buzzwords, but really thinking about too, like, I think a lot about Insight, which is just a radical group of women and femmes and queer folks who were doing the work long before I even knew what the work was. And thinking about the way that they've integrated abolition into their feminism, particularly as like in reaction to particularly gender-based violence, right? How do you deal with gender-based violence outside of the carceral system? And we have a lot of mainstream white feminist organizations working with literally state-funded at this point, right? Like when we think about shelters and we think about most mainstream reactions to gender-based violence, they're extremely state-funded, run by mainstream kind of white feminist spaces. And I was just like playing around on their website before this call because, like, you know, I needed my inspo. And they said, to me, it's just like a small quote. It's like, it's not even probably that deep, but I just love it. So they're saying, like, letting go of assumptions about what a domestic violence program should look like, and instead asking, what would it take to end violence against women and trans people of color, right? So going beyond, again, like reactionary stuff and thinking like, no, like, what is this actual new world where these issues don't exist? And how can we create that new world so that these issues don't exist? And again, going back to what I was saying about having all of these systems being intersected and knowing that, you know, there's no way to abolish violence against women without, you know, abolishing the carceral state, without abolishing the family policing system, without abolishing all these things. And we'll obviously go more into how those systems intersect later, I'm sure.
I don't know if I can add. Okay. Yeah, I thought that was a really beautiful response. I also really liked that you brought up lived experience. And I think that, you know, Patricia Hill Collins talks about this in Black feminist epistemology or Black feminist thought. And it's really interesting because I feel like a lot of feminist scholars or people who kind of are doing feminist work utilize this phrase and don't actually pay attention to what Patricia Hill Collins is saying, especially for Black women. And a lot of what she's saying is that, like, Black women and Black people as individuals have had to survive like horrific violences and have had to gain not even just knowledge, but a certain type of wisdom, right? And so it's not even just like that lived experience is important and it's like a methodology for qualitative studies, but it's an actual like set of wisdom and tactics that we have gained from enduring like violence, right? And I think that's why it's so important that when people say like, listen to Black people, listen to Black women, that it hits different, right? It's like, no, actually, because we have experienced different things. And I think that goes back to like saying, you know, abolition is, yes, of course, dismantling the systems, but, you know, Black people, Black women have had to rely on anti-carceral systems and anti-carceral ways of survival for so long. So that building up has already been happening. That like other way of living, especially even with Indigenous folks, right? Like we've had to find different ways to survive and deal with harm and conflict outside of policing and policing systems. And so again, listening to people who have those experiences is just so important when we're thinking about both Black feminist praxis and abolition.
Right. Yes. And thank you for citing, you're such an academic. Thank you for citing. But and to the point, right, about Patricia Hill Collins, right? And like, we're thinking about like feminist standpoint theory, right? And right, it does things, so much of Black feminist thought can get kind of created into these little sound bites, right? Can like be memeified or whatever, that it like sucks out the meaning, right? So it's not just listen to Black women because I'm guilty, because I'm like dealing with white guilt, or it's not just listen to Black women because that's what Twitter told me to do, right? Like, it's listen to Black women because the way in which they literally sat at the margins of, we've sat at the margins of society and have quite literally had to survive and like create different, all the things, right? Like means that we do have a particular set of knowledge that is not just meaningful for your like social media campaign, but right, like is actually truly meaningful for our abolitionist project, for our revolutionary projects. So continue to cite and call me out when I'm not citing, because just, you know, I'm not in the academic space as much. So I need to like remember to call the folks out. Yeah.
Victoria is very much our neighborhood academic. So it's so rich, because I'm thinking about the ways in particular that family policing is denying not only the most simple things, right? Like the ability to love your children and have what you need, but is also denying folks of what they know, right? So there's all these ways that family policing is always telling families what they need and what they don't need, and they're telling parents how to parent. They're telling moms how to be mothers, and all children how to be kids. And so all these ways that carceral systems are denying people of their very real knowledge of how they want to live, and in thinking about the ways that in so many ways people are engaging in abolitionist futures every day. When people pool together in communities and babysit each other's children, those are abolitionist futures, right? They're reimaginings of ways that communities can fit together, and in so many ways carceral systems are interrupting that and are actually doing like direct harm to those ways of being. So long way of saying, I wonder if y'all could talk a little bit about how does reproductive justice in particular, and perhaps Chelsea, this is a question for you. So how does reproductive justice guide us and thinking about one, creating other ways of care, but also in thinking about what is this expansive notion of like what justice actually is? How does that change how we view caring for children and families?
Yeah, so I'll define reproductive justice and then kind of go into it. So reproductive justice is, according to Sister Song, I'm citing, which is a radical Black women-led organization based out of Atlanta. They define reproductive justice as the human right to bodily autonomy, including three things, right? Including the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to raise the children you have in safe and sustainable communities. And in some ways, when I say that out loud, it feels like not radical, right? It feels like duh, right? Like obvious. And then in other ways, it feels extremely radical, right? So the idea that your right to choose to not have a child is directly linked to your right to raise the children you have or will have in safe and sustainable communities is actually a much more radical notion than maybe like my ears can first like conceptualize when I hear it, right? And, again, I don't want to situate RJ in reaction to like mainstream reproductive health or reproductive rights organizations, but for the sake of talking about kind of reimagining care and all the things, I will. So, RJ was kind of coined in the early 90s when the reproductive rights movement, reproductive health movement had been going on for forever, or not forever, but for a while at that point, right? And folks were really responding and reacting to legal access to particularly abortion, right? So, and for folks who've been paying attention, we know that Roe v. Wade is on the chopping block. I mean, it's low-key been on the chopping block, but particularly with this new case coming out of Mississippi that the Supreme Court, has agreed to hear in the next session, we know that like legal access to abortion is like potentially not going to be a thing, right? However, we know that particularly in Black and Brown communities, access or choice doesn't necessarily equal access, right? And we know that even though it's been the legal right for every woman in the United States, at least, to have access to an abortion, that there are so many barriers that don't allow that to happen. And I can go more in, particularly on my work with like abortion funds and why it's so important, particularly to support your local clinics, your local abortion funds, your local grassroots organizations who are doing the work. But ultimately, I think one of the things I think about often is how abortion in and of itself is an act of care, right? So we know that the majority of people who seek abortions are already parents, right? So when they choose to have an abortion, they're not just choosing it to care for themselves, although that is enough, right? They are choosing often to care for the children that they already have, to care for their families, and ultimately to care for their communities. So saying abortion is an act of care, again, can sound super radical, but in an RJ framework, you're like, okay, 1 + 1 = 2. Yep, that makes sense, right? So that, again, pushes the notion of ways that we understand respectability politics, ways we understand family values, all these things to really reimagine what care looks like. I feel like I lost your other part of your question. What was the second part?
No. I think you covered it. So my question is thinking about how does expanding what it means to care, like through a reproductive justice framework that is saying that not only do you have the right to not have children, but you also have the right to have children and not be policed, and you also have the right to have children and live your life. And so yes, so the question is like, how does employing reproductive justice in that way really expand our vision for our future of what it means to care for children and families?
Right. And I think so I guess, and the other piece about RJ, right, or RJ as in reproductive justice, is, right, the idea that you should be able to parent your children in safe and sustainable communities. And we know all the ways that that's not actually possible in the current carceral state that we live under, right? So if you are afraid of your Black or brown child getting gunned down by the police, ultimately you do not have reproductive freedom, right? That is not RJ. If you are in fear of your children being taken away from you because of any ridiculous, happening, right? Then you are not able to exercise your reproductive freedom. So I think, again, it's like, we know that that third piece is so critical, and connecting it to the fact that caring for your children that you have needs to be beyond a personal choice, but it needs to be a state or a community, right? I don't know if the state should exist. I go back and forth. But that's a conversation for another day. But like, ultimately, that's a community responsibility, right? You are not able to care for your child on your own. You need the systems, you need the community, you need the support in order to do so, to ensure that the children that you do have live in safe and sustainable communities.
Yes. Yes. So, Victoria, this is more of a question for you. So, building off of Chelsea's idea of, community and what it means to be in family, can you talk a little bit about how the family policing system denies that, and then also a little bit about what we can learn from Black feminism as we are advocating for abolition of the family policing system?
Yeah, I'm gonna try and not make this long-winded, but it'll probably be whatever. So I think what is so important about Black feminist praxis or theory, that something that Chelsea already lifted up, was like the importance of Black life, right? And it's like, how do we discuss and uplift Black life and Black aliveness? And I think part of that is dismantling the systems that constantly ignore not only the voices of Black communities, but have worked to take away the autonomy of Black folks and Black women, as Chelsea has just described. So, I mean, earlier when I was discussing the use of language and like the material implications of different tropes and stereotypes that are created and fueled by Western logics, I'm specifically thinking about like what Dorothy Roberts explains as like Black maternal unfitness. So this includes different tropes like the careless Black mother, the matriarch, the Black unwed mothers, of course, like welfare queen tropes. And so Black feminism and Black study really allows us to think through, like, what is language doing? What is this project of misnaming or naming that results in loss of autonomy? And like, what does it mean for these ideological attachments to dictate the systems we create and the tools that we normalize to address harm. So with anti-captivity being central to a Black feminist praxis, we're really refusing the attachments to these sort of logics, these sort of stereotypes, and the subsequent implications that they have on our communities. And with that, the fight for abolition is really innate to me. Like, if one of our goals is liberation, then we shouldn't accept the normalization of these sort of tactics that are brought forth by those who are attempting to capture us or inflicting state violence upon us. And so when we refuse these systems and the collective individuals that have continued to deem our lives as not only unworthy of autonomy and care, but also unworthy of even humanity, right? So like, we're always talking about, as a human being, we are afforded certain access to resources or certain privileges or just like consideration of being alive and existing. But people often forget that like Black folks are dehumanized. Like, we haven't been seen historically and continuing on now as human. So where does that fit in? Again, I don't even know if I answered your question, but well, do you want to, we'll circle back on the question? I feel like I went on a tangent.
Oh no, you did, but I think Chelsea wants to jump in.
No, I'm glad that you lifted up Dorothy Roberts for all the reasons, all the time, right? I think what in her kind of like iconic Killing the Black Body book does really well is connect repro justice to the need to abolish the family policing system and all the various policing and surveillance systems, particularly as they relate to Black women and other Black folks. And I was thinking, like, as you were talking, kind of how Dorothy Roberts and others, right, Angela Davis, other folks, have really kind of mapped out to us how Black women in particular have been, I'm trying to find the right word for this, dehumanized, right, particularly around their reproductive abilities since enslavement, right? So thinking about the ways that reproduction and slavery kind of leading to like eugenics movements, right? Which, as many folks know, has real connections to reproductive rights movements, particularly the beginnings of them with Margaret Sanger and others. Although that is a bit more complex than certain folks would like make it seem. Up until we're thinking about Black and Latina women, particularly Puerto Rican women, dealing with sterilization abuse and other kind of contraceptive coercion. So the ways that certain longer lasting family planning methods were pushed onto Black and brown bodies and Black and brown people, and then connecting that to the abortion rights movement, and then also like throwing in like all the horrible things that have happened in the past couple of decades, particularly around mass incarceration and criminalization, and also welfare reform, and the ways that like Black mothers, particularly Black, Latina, Indigenous mothers as well, have been kind of at the center of all these systems, and how from the very beginning, it's been just the system of dehumanization, right? And ultimately, what's the best way to dehumanize somebody is to control in whichever way, right? Whether it be to have more children to sell or to not have children, so they're less of a population, right? And less of a problem, right? You're dehumanizing folks by quite literally controlling their reproductive abilities, which is like so horrible, when you lay it out that way. And like, as much as we know these things, it like hurts when you say it out loud still. But anyways, I think, that is really important, and particularly thinking about, right now, there's a lot of talk, particularly around like amending the Hyde Amendment, which for folks who don't know, the Hyde Amendment was created in the 70s, basically as a reaction to Roe v. Wade, to successfully bar the use of federal funding for abortions through kind of like people access healthcare federally through Medicare. So you can't access an abortion through federally funded Medicare. And some states where their state funding surpasses that. Anyway, sorry, that was kind of like a side note, but the ways that the Hyde Amendment is part of this long legacy of policies quite literally written into US policy, right? And then other things that were done maybe outside of or because of lack of survey or control around those policies. But I don't know, it's really fascinating to kind of hear that and to recognize that the same people who are being targeted for sterilization abuse, for other reproductive coercion, are the same folks whose families, whose children are being taken away from them. And it's all this kind of same, the target is the same because these systems are intentionally working together to target these folks, to target us, to target Black women, to target Black people, to target Black queer folks.
Sorry, I'll add really quick, Maya, I promise. I just dropping gems. Chelsea just dropping gems. But yeah, I think like that's what's so important is even just Dorothy Roberts as a scholar, like what she offers us in Killing the Black Body and Shattered Bonds is that these systems don't work. They work in conjunction all the time. These policies, like ASFA, I'm thinking about ASFA right now. Like these policies work together. Like, and so when we're doing child welfare system or family policing reform, and we're narrowing our reform to like cultural competency training and like cultural humility training, like that doesn't actually solve these larger structural problems of reproductive justice issues, of just like family separation generally. Like that doesn't actually get to addressing these structural harms that are like the actual important things that we're trying to target or dismantle. So I just wanted to raise up that was beautifully stated, Chelsea.
Well, okay, so actually you read my mind because Chelsea, when you started mentioning policies, I was going to ask Victoria to talk a little bit about these seminal like child welfare policies like the Adoption and Safe Families Act that have contributed to the separation of families, and then also thinking about the ways that systems are working together. So I'm also particularly thinking of like the crime bill and the fact that those things are like happening at the same time. So if you could, for folks who maybe don't know about these big bucket policies, speak a little bit about how policies have really shaped family separation across systems.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I'm going to focus probably on ASFA right now. And I just wanted to uplift Movement for Family Power, who just is doing amazing just work organizing, but also making so many moves in terms of policy and advocating, and Joyce, of course, advocating for so many changes right now, like currently happening, and so to support them. But yeah, I think ASFA is really important for me, or something that I've been focusing on generally, because in my own like research, of course, neighborhood academic here, even in my own research, like I was looking at the National Association of Black Social Workers, which nobody listens to, of course, because that's why we're here today. But 18 years ago, they called for the repeal of ASFA. And of course, like Dorothy Roberts has been, you know, if we're reading through all of these different congressional hearings from that time, where you can see that Dorothy has always been there championing these policy changes and repealing these horrible like policy decisions we've made because of the violences enacted on Black communities. And so I just wanted to highlight that, because right now, Movement for Family Power is like really trying to repeal ASFA and trying to educate all of us about why the expediting termination of parental rights is so harmful for Black communities, because that's what ASFA does, right? ASFA really, it puts up these time limits for family reunification. It really expedites family separation, and it incentivizes it. So it literally rewards states for pushing children into adoption. And of course, who does that harm? It harms Black communities, Indigenous communities, communities of color. And so I think what I really wanted to highlight is not only the work that people are doing right now, but the fact that we're still here. Like we're still here, and these things have been voiced by Black people for decades. And it's so like, it's like, where is this disconnect? As social workers, we're obviously not listening to people we need to be listening to. If there was a call to repeal ASFA 18 years ago and we're still stuck on cultural competence training, there's a disconnect. And you can say, listen to Black women, but if you're literally ignoring the fact that we're still here, and this is still a debate, like expediting parental termination is still a debate, then we have so much work to do, right? And so I just wanted to highlight again, like really just educate yourself and listen to like people who are doing this work, like Movement for Family Power, Joyce. They're doing some really good work around like Miranda rights. Like when I ask people about consent and data sharing, that's really a taboo thing. So thinking through like, what are these the implications of using data and mass proliferation of data collection? Things like that are really important when we're thinking about abolition and child welfare or family policing.
Absolutely. Because you mentioned Miranda rights and thinking about some of the changes that have been happening, I think especially in New York around policies and interacting. I'm thinking in particular about, there's a link here, I think that's not often discussed, especially in the child welfare space, between reproductive justice and thinking about like drug testing mothers and parents at birth, and how the racist roots of that we know, but how that is leading into entrance into the child welfare system. And so I think we have a lot to learn here, child welfare folks, about reproductive justice and our frame. But I'm wondering if y'all could talk a little bit, and Chelsea, you can start a little bit about drug testing, the history of that, and why that is so connected to reproductive justice.
Yeah. So again, thinking of the RJ framework, right? The ability to have children, the ability to not have children, or the right to have children, excuse me, the right to not have children, and the right to raise your children in safe and sustainable communities. I mean, ultimately, first of all, the healthcare system, right? Like, if going through the lens of RJ in general, just like you're already walking into like a shit fire of just like, oh my gosh, this healthcare system is horrible. And we know that abortion particularly and other forms of, other forms of RJ type of healthcare are just, it's even worse, right? So there's this sense of extreme distrust, right, with healthcare professionals, particularly because of the ways that healthcare professionals have been connected to police and other surveillance systems, right? And again, it's the same folks, right? We're talking about the same types of people who are targeted. We're talking about the same types of people who don't have access to services, or when they do, right, what are the types of places that Black and Brown people and women particularly are accessing services, right? So they're accessing services often in public facilities, they're accessing services in already highly policed neighborhoods, right? So ultimately, the idea that we know that Black mothers are like drug tested at crazy rates, often without their consent. And we know that often leads to their children being taken away from them. Often also just like ripple effects, right? Of like, even if they're going in for just like a pregnancy test and just kind of basic screenings, and then suddenly they're, on some list and they're dealing with all this stuff. So, I mean, ultimately, here we're talking about the connection of like RJ, healthcare, family policing, the general like criminal legal system, and all the ways that it basically screws Black and Brown mothers and other pregnant folks over, and folks even if they're no longer pregnant or don't need to, or don't hope to be pregnant, etc. So, yeah, it's horrible. And it's kind of the perfect representation of the ways that we don't actually, again, dehumanizing, right? The ways that we don't actually trust that folks can make the right decisions for their bodies, can have private conversations with their doctors, can, oftentimes folks are seeking help, right? Like folks are like, hey, like I just found I'm pregnant. Like I actually want to get clean. What does that look like? And the ways that we like, people think that they're having confidential conversations that are used against them. So it's loaded, right? And again, thinking about Dorothy Roberts connecting these systems and other folks as well. There's much to be learned and I think continue to be unpacked there. But ultimately, we know that folks should be allowed to access healthcare without the surveillance of really anybody. The healthcare should also be free, but that's, another story. It should be in safe, places, all those things. So yeah, but Victoria, please jump in.
Yeah, that was great. I think like it goes back to largely uh us pathologizing and individualizing these issues, right? Like there has been a shift in how we view harm and conflict, especially harm caused to children. And that moves from this sort of societal blaming or the societal responsibility to take care of each other, right? Increasing or improving the material conditions of people that people live in. So that's providing housing for folks, that's providing, you know, equitable freaking pay, like decent labor wages, right? Or, you know, abolishing work in itself, but whatever, again, a different conversation. But, you know, it's going back to these like societal issues, right? Like we're blaming these other failures, these structural failures, but we have shifted into individualizing these harms and really blaming folks for the things that happen, right? And so I think that's where this proliferation of mandatory reporting and drug testing really comes in. And it's like, of course, you don't have to, or we don't have to provide consent for drug testing because we're trying to protect the child, right? And you're a bad mother and you don't deserve to like mother your child and they don't deserve to be in their community. It goes back to this very individualizing problem. And I think that's where one of the biggest shifts that needs to happen when we're talking about abolition and the family policing system is shifting back to that responsibility, mutual responsibility of each other, but also like improving the conditions that people live in, that we exist in. And that's what I think is really, really so important. I also wanted to circle back really quick. And yeah, I didn't define ASFA, and that's the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which was passed by the Clinton administration in 1997. So for anybody, I was just dropping the acronym. I apologize for that. So yeah.
Yeah, and Victoria, I think to the point, right, of like, particularly as we like hear in like anti-choice rhetoric, it's all connected, right? So like the same anti-choicers are the same folks trying to lock you up, or the same, you know, folks trying to, I don't know, take over the country in January 6th. You know, it's all the same people. But basically, it's interesting that this is like this supposed children or babies over mothers or over parents every time, all the time. Even in the case when, you know, they want to end the pregnancy, you know, it's this like obsession with supposedly caring so much about these, and you know, these potential children, right? That, and it's used often so much in anti-choice rhetoric, right? And particularly used to demonize Black women, brown women who decide to have abortions as well. I'm thinking of like those like horrible billboards that they say the like most dangerous place for a Black child is in the womb, or like something ridiculous. But these are all the same type of, you know, this is all the same messaging, just kind of being recycled and positioned differently, right? And then it's interesting too, because it's often like, we care so much about children, but really what you care about is punishing mothers, punishing parents, right? Because we know, like, we know all the ways that, like, the ways you're trying to save the child by quite literally either trying to coerce women not to have an abortion, or by removing the children from their home, or all these ways. We know that these like are not actually like the right things to do. And we know that there are harms that go with that, but yet it's under this guise of like, we're saving, but really you're focused on punishing, right? And we want to constantly demonize mothers and parents, Black and brown folks, for quite literally just existing, but also for exercising their choices, whatever they might be, right? Whether those choices are, in some instances, to do things like take drugs, or do things like, you know, all these different things, right? We at the end of the day, like, we are so hyper-focused on punishing versus, as you mentioned, working in community, are thinking about these things beyond individualized harm or individualized social ill or whatever. So yeah, I find it like really fascinating the way that folks love to just talk about, well, we're just, you know, we're saving Black and brown kids. I swear that's what we're doing. And we know that it's just not the case.
Yeah, and again, to even add on to that as well, like when we're thinking about, because I think through a lot of things related to data and sort of like technologies that we're starting to use, and it all goes back to, again, like these different logics that people are employing. So I'm even thinking about how pregnant mothers are starting to be tracked, right? We're trying to like guess the risk of abuse, like of your child that is not born yet. You know what I mean? Like there are so many ways that now we're even trying to predict or like write in like the death or the like inevitable separation of children that are not yet born, right? And so it's like how are these logics even seeping into our prevention efforts? You know what I mean? Like what does prevention mean, and what are you trying to prevent and to whom? And so this is like why I'm very skeptical about some of these different uses of data or these calls for collection of data, because it's really a lot of times reproducing these same logics, and like how do we separate ourselves from that? So yeah, those are amazing points, Chelsea.
So my mind is spinning, but I want to take us to thinking a little bit more along this line of this obsession with saving children, and even when that obsession means harming children, but also harming their families, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about Ma'Khia Bryant and talk a little bit about the fact that she was in care at that time, in foster care, and the fact that her grandmother was quite literally trying to house them and keep that family together, and how the system's obsession with saving her ultimately led to her being out of care of her community and to her subsequent murder by the state. And I want to, so a two-part question here. And so thinking about how do we use Black feminism and reproductive justice to reimagine care for families that actually need assistance, but also for families who are fighting to assist themselves in many ways, right? And then also thinking about how do the white supremacist underpinnings of family policing help us understand what happened in this case and what needs to be done to prevent this from ever happening again? And so anyone can start.
I mean, I can start. I have a feeling Victoria will take us to another level, so I'll get us started. So I mean, I think the more I think about the situation with Ma'Khia Bryant, like the angrier I get, right? Like I'm angry that her life was ended that way, right? I'm angry that she was in placement. I'm angry that the media response. I'm angry by certain members of certain movements or certain, just kind of the lack of care for Black girls, right? Like it's like we know this, right? We know as Black women that like folks just don't give a damn about Black girls, right? And especially for our Black girls who are, labeled whatever we want to label her in that moment because of, the circumstances, right? Oh, she was aggressive, or the fact that people say that she appeared older because of her body, right? We know that Black children in general are assumed to be, adults in the way that the media talks about them, but particularly I think Black girls as particularly, right? And then also Black girls who are, Ma'Khia Bryant was not, the picture perfect, acceptable version of what a Black girl can or should be, right? Whether it was her body, whether it was her actions, whether it was her family circumstances, right? So I think ultimately just kind of really reminded of the ways that even our folks that sometimes we organize with or are in community with don't show up for Black girls the way that we show up for Black boys, the way that we show up for Black men. It's just like a kind of like a hurtful reminder. I think one of the interesting things about the Ma'Khia Bryant situation, if I remember reading this correctly, was that her mother actually intentionally kind of sought help, right? And she said, I can't take care of these children anymore. And I think that that's like a really kind of complicated moment, right? Where folks are like, well, the way that Makia entered the system was actually through her mother kind of electing and her mother kind of seeking help. And let me know if I'm getting any of these details wrong. But I think that this complicates the way that systems seep into our mentalities, right? Seep into our norms, and how many of us grow up in spaces where child services is just normal, right? The amount of many of us who it's normal, right? It's normal. Like, this friend is in this placement and, this, and they're coming in the house to visit, it's just like so overly normalized to the point that folks grow up and then like actively can seek them, even when they know deep down that they're not actually that helpful or that they can be harmful. So I deal with that kind of nuance of the fact that her mother kind of elected to put her children into placement. And then of course, dealing with the fact that like her grandmother was actively seeking to get them back, finding housing for them, for Makia and her siblings. And just this complexity and the fact that like, we make it so difficult for families to take care of their own families, right? We quite literally create systems that make it like impossible for us to take care of ourselves, at least in the ways that the state or these various surveillance systems deem acceptable, right? So it's just like, it's mind-blowing and scary and sad and heartbreaking the ways that even led her into that home at that time and that space. And then, the fact that she was murdered at the hands of another kind of state police officer, right? The same, like all part of the same system that is supposed to be taking care of her, part of the system that said, whoa, no, you're in harm, let's do better. Oh no, you can't be with your grandmother because she needs more than, I think, 2 bedrooms or whatever the details were. It's mind-blowing and it's tragic. And it quite literally, like Makia Bryan's story, I think, and I don't ever want to like limit her to lessons, right? Because like ultimately, like for all the lessons that we could learn from her death, like I keep them, like just like keep that baby alive, like let her keep doing her TikTok videos, laying down her edges, doing her fun hair. Like, I'm not going to do hair. Like it's so joyous to watch some of her videos, but so I don't want to limit it to be like, oh, well, through her we learn, or like pull a Nancy Pelosi and be like, what did she say about George Floyd? She's like, it's something ridiculous, right? Like you died so we can learn, or like something, just ridiculous. But anyways, I don't want to do that. However, there are lessons to be learned. And I think if we actually critically peel back the layers of her story, there is a Black feminist analysis and critique and a way to show quite literally why all of these systems failed her, and why these systems should be abolished, and why there are other ways that we can build care. We can recognize that families will need help, and we need both systems and structures, but also like actual like community, right? Like other humans, humans that are trusted, humans that are in the same space to step in and support.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add because that was it. Like, mic drop. Yeah. I think that, yeah, dang, you hit all the spots. To go back to like an abolitionist praxis, which is Black feminist, if we say that Black feminist theory or praxis is like a project of anti-captivity, or we're concerned with anti-captivity, then it just makes sense that abolitionist praxis is innate, right? And so, when we take up an abolitionist praxis or think through like transformative justice, we are accepting the fact that humans are dynamic and complicated. We always will be. And so I think a lot of times people who are new to abolition sort of are assuming or expecting that we are thriving for this utopia, and we're not, right? We're not. We are acknowledging that real harm happens. There are children, there are some grotesque and awful things that happen to children, but we're saying that doesn't mean that it necessitates state or police violence, right? And so I think what's so important is for anybody who's really new to abolition is to understand that we're saying that there is a different way that we can address harm, and that really begins with community and anti-carceral care. It's building up these trusting and mutual relationships. That's divesting from police and police systems to invest in kinship care, community care, where we don't have to separate children permanently from their parents or at all from their communities or their other family members, right? Like, we acknowledge that again, like this term family is like, you know, what does that even mean for people who are Black or Indigenous or like people from other communities of color? Like our family is extended to community oftentimes, right? And so it's like, how do we uplift care through these sort of systems or these sort of networks, and not rely on policing and punishment? And I think that's what's so beautiful about like Mia's work through Bay Area Transformative Justice Coalition, which I always uplift, like her pod mapping exercises, right? Like it not only maps out people who you trust, or people like for children, for adults, for everyone, people who you trust and can call on when you've been harmed, but it also calls in people who have caused harm, right? And that's something that our current system of retributive or like criminal justice doesn't do. It calls people in through pod mapping. It calls people in to say, hey, how can I be held accountable? Who can I call, and what does that mean for myself, my relationship with whom I'm harmed in the larger community? So I just wanted to uplift that, like, if we're really taking a lens to the child welfare or family policing system and looking structurally at like the tools it uses, which is family separation, no matter how much you reform it, that is the main tool of the child welfare system. How do we dismantle that, and what are other ways that we can practice care and love and relationships? So, yeah.
That is so beautiful. And yes, just yes, I think that there's a way that we don't want to be complicated about the realities that people are facing. And Chelsea, you reminded me of Dorothy Roberts again. Of course, we've mentioned her about 10 times, but of her work and thinking and through research and this qualitative research she did around what family policing does to neighborhoods and people's relationships, and how we end up relying on carceral systems, even though we know that they're not going to save us. And then I think back to why is the child welfare system, why was that her only option to call, right? And why is the police our only option? And what does it look like to create more options? Why are they only the only resource options, right? Like, and why are we constantly asked to call these often death-making institutions for help, despite what we know? And I think about that a lot.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I mean, again, like adding to the complexity of Makia's story is that it was her mother who elected to get support, right, from the child welfare system. And then it was, I don't remember if it was Makia or her sister. I think there was some back and forth on that called the police, right? So we're talking about the fact that these systems have been told that that are here to support us, right? And folks, even if we're not fully bought into it, find ourselves relying on these same systems, right? And we can all think about that in our personal lives, right? Like when there have been times where you're like, yeah, no. And then like suddenly you find yourself, especially when you think about it as a child and the ways that you deal with family, like you find yourself engaging with these systems. So that when we think about, like, what does it mean to kind of look towards a world towards abolition? What does it mean to kind of have community care? It's not just, while there are already folks practicing abolition and practicing community care, like we still have a lot of people to bring into that space. And there is a lot of ways that we need to be practicing this so that on the day-to-day, we're not calling in these systems intentionally or electedly, right? And I think the pod mapping exercise is something I did last summer that I found really interesting that I had never, even thought about. Like, how do we think about who is there for you to support you? And then you also think you get creative, right? Because you're like, well, actually, like, I know if something goes down, like, actually, that person who I maybe have not talked to recently is actually really going to hold it down. And these are all the people that I have. And if you're lucky, you already have many folks in your kind of community and in your kind of close proximity, physically or emotionally, right? But then, even if you don't, and even if you do, there's so much more that we can be doing to kind of create relationship with folks who are near us, folks who are our neighbors, folks who can support us in those times. So it's just, again, it's like, it's a mind-blowing kind of thing when you're analyzing her story to realize that while oftentimes these systems are kind of interjecting, right, and kind of coming in without an invitation. Other times they are coming in with an invitation, and we have to make sure that we're thinking about the ways that we can make sure that folks aren't thinking that that's their only alternative or their only source of support.
I appreciate that so much because, I mean, back to our earlier conversation, we talked a lot about, yes, we do want to tear things down, we do want to end systems, but we're also struggling together about, you know, what is the world that we want to create, and thinking about what do we want to see, what do we want to see more of, and how do we create a world where people don't have to rely on these carceral systems. And so I want to pick up on something, Victoria, that you just said, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about some of the work that is going on now to sort of imagine alternatives to family policing and building out communities.
Yeah, I mean, my mind is like spinning now too, because there's so much. I think one thing that I wanted to kind of underpin is that like, one, I like really hate how the term reimagine has been being used, because it's just like reimagine. And it's just like, but I think it's so important that that we actually talk about what this means, right? Like, so when Chelsea's talking about like pod mapping, and like people might not have supports, right? So like, what are the ways that, like, in the moments when we're just discussing with our friends, even like, how do we address conflict? How creative do we get? Like, what are the ways that we address harm every single day? And I think oftentimes when people are introduced to abolition, they're like trying to make these big, huge strides, and they're trying to think about these huge, like, state violence, things of state violence, and like people dying in the streets. But it's like, you can start by thinking about conflict in your own life, harm in your own life. I was at a training, I think it was with Miriam Kaba, and she was talking about like, okay, like if you came home and your cousin took your TV, would you call the police on him? It's like, no, I would probably be like, yo, where my TV at? You know what I mean? Like, can you bring my TV back? What you need? Do you need money? Is that why you took my TV? Like, we handle these things without calling the police often, like the ways we address harm. And so it's even starting there and thinking about, dang, do I talk to my neighbor? Does my neighbor have my number if they ever needed me? My best friend, like, she lives right next to a supermarket. We go in, hey, can you look over my house when I'm gone? Make sure everything looks okay. Like, it's sort of just building up these relationships. And so I don't necessarily have like, or can't pinpoint specific policies aside from like ASFA and other things that are happening, because I think these things generally happen every single day. And I think that like the more that we can pull people in discussing it in this kind of framing makes it not more practical, but like it allows people to be like, oh wow, like I am actually more in tune with abolitionist praxis than I think. It doesn't have to be this like huge, like take down the system today, but even these small relationship building practices and like care and mutual responsibility and empathy can go a long way. And I think as a social worker, you know, there's a lot of work that we have to do, right? And like really abandoning everything we know, literally everything we know, like everything that you're taught in social work practice, like, you know, like, because we're taught to come in and save and ascribe people to DSM categorizations and like punish certain people, go in people's homes and look for risk. And like, we really have to abandon so much of that and actually turn again our frame to like, oh, what are other ways of providing or care or leaving people alone? Like, how do we step back and be called into spaces? Something we have to grapple with. So again, I think that there's a lot going on in different organizing spaces. And I think there's a lot going on daily with people and thinking through this sort of change that needs to happen. And I hope that answered.
And a lot happening in schools as well too, right? Like, how do we build restorative justice practices? How do we practice abolition in schools beyond just like getting rid of police officers in schools? Like, duh, right? That's like bare minimum, right? Like, how are we bringing this in so that young people are kind of taught these tools? And in Makia Bryan's case, right? Like, if, you know, like, I'm not saying that would have saved her because, you know, but like there are ways that we can be training young people to think about abolition and think about ways to handle conflict outside of engaging in state systems. And I think that's one thing I'm always really excited about, is to see some of the great work happening in our school systems, kind of in spite of administrators, often because of like really awesome, passionate folks who are working on the ground. Yeah, I think that's part of it too, because it's not impossible, right? But it's hard to kind of introduce new understandings of community and care with folks who are like, huh, you know, like, whereas kind of building up and making that kind of the norm with young folks, I think is an important practice and something I'm seeing more and more.
I think too, like, because we're talking about schools, and schools are like the #1 site of mandatory reporters, right? And so like, how do we think through getting rid of like this relationship building, if you would call it that, this relationship building through mandatory reporting, and rather like, how do we establish these connections without being under this very coercive and state sanctioned like mechanism of dealing with harm? Like what can we envision differently when we suspect or think that there might be some harm being caused to a child? Like, what does it mean for that? Like, what can we envision in sort of that kind of space? And I think, I can't remember who said this, but it was either one of my friends or something, but they were talking about like how even having these huge classroom sizes, like that even takes away from these personal relationships you can build with children, and like not have to just like rely on these quick fixes of mandatory reporting. So I think there's just like so many places where we can start to like edge out change.
That's such a good point around teachers and school administrators in general, and kind of mandatory reporting piece there. And yeah, good point too, of thinking of like classroom size as being a vehicle to increase community and road to abolition. I like that. I didn't think about that.
So I'm actually wondering if you can talk a little bit more about mandatory reporting for folks who don't know, as this system of surveillance and how that comes into play. I mean, we've even talked about domestic violence, for example. We've talked about all these instances, but if folks don't know what mandatory reporting looks like in family policing, if you could expand on that.
Yeah. So I guess I won't go like super into like the histories and everything, but it just goes back to like, it was created because of sort of this shift again, and this ideological shift in terms of like, we're now not blaming societal issues, right? We're more so focused on this individualizing, kind of pathologizing blame. And so mandatory reporting basically is like, it's really expansive now. Like, there are so many people who are required by the state or federally to report any suggested or suspected instances of child abuse or neglect. And so this could mean a range of things. This is like a child coming in and they look dirty, or they've been wearing the same clothes for a certain amount of days, or they're acting out in class and it's a little suspicious, or they come in to class with a black eye. Like, there are so many things that a person is expected to report. And I think that a lot of what happens is, because we have these really high profile cases of child abuse and neglect, it ramps up this fear of missing something, right? And if in mandatory reporting laws, if you fail to report, you are now under you can be incarcerated. Like, you are now under the criminal justice system. That is the way we wanted to handle child abuse and neglect, right? So now, as social workers, as teachers, as grocery workers now, interesting, people in church, yeah, they're expanding into grocery workers. It's crazy. Now, as one of these folks who are around children, if you do not report, you are also held responsible. And so it's just this cycle of a lot of fear-based decision-making that has really overwhelmed, I would say, the child welfare system. And even with that, like, in LA County, we're now seeing some of these like new automated technologies that if you call into like the mandatory reporting hotline, they will flag certain words as higher risk. And so it's just like mandatory reporting, I think, is just growing so much And we do not scrutinize it as much as we need to. Some of us do, a lot of Black organizers do, but as a society, we don't scrutinize it as much, again, because it goes back to this like attachment to this like individualizing blame. And I think I answered.
No, you totally did. I just wanted to make sure we were touching on that for folks who might not be familiar with that concept. So I think we have time for a question before we close out. And actually, I think this does relate to mandatory reporting a lot. I do think that sometimes, you know, folks are calling because they see a child in need, and again, that is. There's a lot of racism that goes into it too, but I also think that people are like, well, what do I do? So we have this question from John Kelly, which is, what would a Black feminist approach to proactively identifying instances where children weren't safe at home?
So I don't know if I'm going to answer this question in a way that is like useful for people, but this is just what I'm thinking when I hear this question. It goes back to like the use of the word proactively is really interesting to me, because again, I feel like it leads to this sort of like anticipation, or I don't know. I'm still grappling with that verbiage. But Black feminist approach to proactively identifying instances where children were truly not safe at home. This goes back to what we're saying about an abolitionist praxis or transformative justice, right? If it's the case that children are unsafe at the home, which does happen, like there are some abuses that happen within the home, and that's, as an abolitionist, like we understand even like child sexual abuse, right? Things like this happen, but it's a fact of the matter of like, why are we relying on the child welfare system and these systems of punishment and policing to address these issues, right? Like why is there not more reliance on community infrastructure, on establishing these relationships where we might be able to address this harm in a way that doesn't add more harm or community or family separation? So does that mean that a child needs to be staying with aunt for like an amount of time? And can that happen without the child welfare system surveillance? Can we handle that in our own communities? Like, what does it mean to address the person who's causing the harm, depending on what harm has been caused? Like, what does that accountability look like within that family structure? I think that's what's so important about a Black feminist praxis. And I think that's what's not being addressed in the current systems that we have. There's no way to address that because we have these laws and regulations that are already prescripting how we address harm. It's like remove child, mandatory reporting, remove child, sign up for maybe some programs, maybe child doesn't even get reunified at all, which we see happens. So it doesn't even really like where do children's voices or rights even come up with that? Like where does their autonomy even come up with within that system too? Like that's something that I'm thinking through as well. So I think the question for me is like, how do we go back to building up these alternatives to the child welfare system when these real harms happen? Hopefully that answered.
And wow, I think those, yes. I mean, I couldn't have answered it better myself. So I think we have another audience question from Andrea Portillo, which is, can you all speak more to the relationships between family policing and the immigration system? These issues are often working in silos. And I won't call on y'all, but whoever.
I can take a stab, yeah. So I mean, I'm thinking a lot about the immigration system as it is really just another function, right, of policing and of mass criminalization, mass incarceration, right? So, and also thinking about the ways, talking about right language and messaging around the ways we talk about kind of unaccompanied children at the border, the images that we're kind of receiving, and really just kind of this like manufactured border crisis anyway, right? So, I mean, we know that there are children, particularly who are crossing the border unaccompanied, or in some cases accompanied, and then are like, you know, arbitrarily being, you know, separated from their families, and then put into, we see the photos of them in these kind of like ICE detention centers, but then often then put into some type of, family placement, and all the ways that that can be complicated and nuanced and really messed up, right? But we know also too, I'm thinking about how the immigration system intersects with reproductive justice and the ways that we've seen, particularly, the stories coming out of Georgia and the ways that folks who've been detained have been treated and been forced to go under various kind of sterilization and other reproductive justice or reproductive abuses, right? So, I mean, ultimately, we know that the immigration system is BS, right? It's operating with the same type of kind of surveillance and punishment model. This idea that people who are moving their bodies are somehow inherently criminal. This idea that children who are, again, moving their bodies and just like walking in many, I mean, not saying that their walks are short at all, but what I'm trying to do is complicate kind of the notion of migration, right? And how that's so politicized in ways that don't make sense. But yeah, like we know that particularly how we're thinking about immigration and how we demonize certain folks within this immigration debate, right? So there's kind of like innocent folks, this creation of these like horrible images of the folks who are traffickers and the folks who are these negative people are the people who are coming in the country to do bad. So I don't know, just a lot of thoughts there that probably aren't fully coherent. But I do agree that we need to continue to kind of bridge those silos between, I mean, all of these systems, but especially for me, when I'm thinking about like the criminal legal system, always kind of having the understanding that the immigration system is just like an arm of that. So yeah, I don't know if y'all want to talk more specifically about like how children are treated in those systems. I have like some knowledge, but not as much.
Yeah, I'm also like not super well equipped to speak on like what happens to youth in the family who come from like undocumented families or families who are undocumented. So I can't really speak to the specifics of that, and I don't want to answer it incorrectly. So I'm not going to get too much into that. What I think is really important for me when I think about, ICE and immigration is like, largely thinking about how we often cause state violence causes the harm and then tries to fix it in the same, like you're literally reproducing the harm that you're trying to fix. Like, do you understand that? Like the fact that we establish these borders and have these heavily policed and carceral like tactics coming out to really police the way people are moving geographically, like is beyond crazy to me. And then we're trying to solve it and rectify the issue in the same way that we caused it and utilizing the same logics that have caused it. And so I think like, again, like constantly reflecting on why we feel like family separation anywhere is violence, right? So constantly thinking through like, why are we even having this issue? And like, what are the policies and changes we need to make structurally, largely to even prevent this issue from even happening? And then in the same token, I think a lot about data, right? And this is something that I don't think a lot of people are thinking about, but like we have these large shared databases. So what does it mean for us to be sharing information with not only like county and local law enforcement, but with federal law enforcement, right? With ICE, like what data is being collected, what data is being shared, what does the consent process look like if there is any? And the fact that we can't readily answer these questions often moves us towards like this like conversation about one, transparency within the child welfare system, and just like how these different processes of data collection, surveillance, and like data use like really intersects across these different lanes, right? Through school, through ICE, through these camps, through local criminal justice systems. So those are sort of the like intersections I'm seeing personally between like ICE or immigration. But there's probably so much more and so many other people who can speak to this. And I'm sorry that I don't have like citations on hand, but but yeah.
Yeah, and just to add, I think also to your point, Victoria, about kind of like solving a problem that you created by doing this. I mean, also just thinking about what is fueling immigration, right, from particularly our southern border, and the ways that the US government has intervened, has destabilized, and has caused violence and mass poverty that has led to migration, and then like it's just all this like weird pattern, again, connecting, thinking about militarization, thinking about the way that the US operates economically, and how all of that connects to our vision as well of like an abolitionist future, is all deeply connected. So, I mean, abolish the border, as we're also abolishing some other things.
Yeah, no, that's like the larger point we're trying to make, right? And what Black feminist praxis like tries to make, right, is that like liberation for us is liberation for everyone. And so like when we're thinking, a lot of times, is again speaking from like someone who's trained in social work, like we like to think of the child welfare system as this like small little thing, and it's like foster care and adoption. But no, like if we really expand like we're doing right now in this conversation to think about like the collusion between all of these different systems, we will see that it's fueled by this one like logic of like racial terrorism, capitalism, you know what I mean? Like imperialism, like these are all of the things that are fueling every single one of these systems, and that's how they're all connected. So that means that our solutions have to come out of cross solidarity movements, like reproductive justice movements, abolition movements generally, right, in criminal justice and child welfare and ICE, labor movements. Like they have to intersect with all of these movements, because our issue isn't confined to just family separation in the child welfare system. It's this larger issue. And so I think that is like a fantastic point to make about any of these issues.
Absolutely. And I also think we gain so much when we're building upon each other, right, in these movements and challenging the logic that is separating families within the child welfare system, but is also separating families at the border, right? That it's relying on the same logic, and how do we build off of not just what is happening, but lessons learned from resistance, right? And what people are doing to actively resist those systems. So I think that we have one final audience question. Knowing that abolitionist steps are about building up community relationships, what are the roles for nonprofit and system folks in trying to dismantle carceral systems? And how can folks support and also get out of the way of community organizers?
Can I see the first part of the question again?
And if you want me to start, I can start off too, if you want me to, and then you want to end, whichever.
Yeah, let me get my thoughts together. I got some thoughts, but I got to get them together.
I know, like, I have thoughts. These might come out jumbled, but whatever. So the nonprofit industrial complex is really, really interesting to me. I'm not going to get like super into it, but in the same token, one, I just want us to like, I wanted to uplift the fact that like, in certain communities, there are specific resources that are available, right? And sometimes those are nonprofits. So I just want to acknowledge that, like, there is this nonprofit industrial complex, which I'm about to get into, but like, in some token, like support is support in some ways. And if I'm trying to survive and I need things like literal resources, and this nonprofit next to me is the only one that I can get these resources from, you know, like what can I do? So I just wanted to uplift that. But in terms of just nonprofits, like, and this goes for not only nonprofits, but like philanthropic, like ventures and like these large, you know, like mass amounts of white money, like we have to think about how these monies are dispersed and what they're dispersed to, and like who these industries or these collective individuals or organizations deem as important, and what what sort of issues are deemed important, right? So like I think that in terms of nonprofits, if we're thinking through like people who are bound to grants uncertain grants and like what funding sources we have, there are some really problematic issues in terms of like what is actually getting funded and then what is not getting funded on the same end. And so I know that's really generally speaking about those sorts of relationships between the nonprofits, but like on one end, some of them provide critical resources that are needed. And so we have to really think critically about like what it means to like abolish the nonprofit industrial complex. Like what does that really mean? And how do we supply support in other ways through like mutual aid and things like that. But then we also have to think about, like what are these larger funding and the grants that people are attached to, and what does that mean, or what are the implications that has for the communities that we work with? So I know that's kind of a vague question, but I think there's just so much to talk about. And I think Insight, they have a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, I believe. Great book, a great resource for anybody who wants to read more about that. And then in terms of like, how can you support community organizers, but also get out of the way of community organizers? I think that one takes really like reflection on your part and like what your positionality is in that space. Two, that comes with like, when you step into a space of organizing, you ask, how can I help? Like, you don't just assume that they need help with so many other things. So like, you listen and then you ask, how can I help? And then you move with the organizers who are moving. And I think that those two things go hand in hand. Like, if you're listening, you won't be assuming. And then like what Chelsea was saying, money, like, people need money, people need resources, people need money. So like, give people money without the strings attached that often come with some of these nonprofits, right? No strings attached sort of money. And then Chelsea.
Yeah, no, I mean, you took a lot of what I was going to say. I mean, I'm obsessed with thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex in ways that are probably not healthy. And I probably need to stop reading The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. But for those who haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. And I think, one, I want to challenge a little bit this dichotomy of like community organizer versus nonprofit, employee, right? We know that like these lines are blurred and many folks are both. And in some cases, the ways that they're community organizing are actually through 501c3s and, so that dichotomy isn't as clear. I mean, it is clear if you're like a nonprofit exec at like a huge national nonprofit that you're probably not a community organizer, but you might have folks who have stronger ties to the community on your staff. So I think complicating that notion, I think nonprofits, particularly nonprofit executives and other folks that are fundraisers, need to really reckon with the role that they play in legitimizing carceral states. I think the question was like, what roles can nonprofits do in like dismantling? I think they need to really reckon with how they actually legitimize those systems, right? And the carceral state in general. And also, I think folks need to evaluate their nonprofit's historical role and in that space, and also their individual roles, right? And the ways that they legitimize that, right? Whether it's through your interactions with certain systems or actors, whether it's through certain messaging, whether it's, there's so many ways that that we all, I mean, at times can feed into saying these systems make sense or these systems should exist, right? So we need to really kind of unpack all of that and always unpack that. And I don't think that we're going to be able to abolish nonprofits anytime soon. But I do think that we can work more strategically to make sure that our movements aren't led by or headed by 501c3s and instead are led by folks who are really in the community and then perhaps supported by nonprofits. So I think, I think that is a short answer. I feel like I have so much to say on the nonprofit industrial complex. I'm almost like, keep talking, because I'm sure there's more gems here. But I guess I'll leave it at that and just, really recommend. Oh, that was the other thing too. I think like this idea of mutual aid versus like foundation funding. I think that's also like a weird dichotomy that isn't always true. I mean, like quite literally there's a difference on like how you get your money. But I've seen even folks in like certain reproductive justice spaces talking about mutual aid models. And yes, like having, regular folks donate money to causes is technically mutual aid, but let's not co-opt mutual aid to make it seem as though that's what your organization is doing. So I just need to be careful with that as well. But but I do think obviously moving to mutual aid models and really recognizing how you as an individual can not only give to your community, but also receive from your community, right? Because that's what makes it mutual. And what are the things that we can be giving back and receiving? But yeah, I think it's complicated, and I think probably most folks on this call are either working at technically universities or nonprofits, you know what I mean, studying at, working at, or have worked at nonprofits. So we all need to kind of interrogate our roles and ways that we can do better. And yeah, and the thing about money too, the other thing I want to say really quickly about funding is 100% agree, larger nonprofits need to get out the way so that funding can go directly to local organizations. And what often happens is that we have several levels of funneling, right? So a huge foundation gives this money to this, and then this and this. And what happens there is just the money, there's not as much money as when it started up there. So finding ways to make sure that, if there is, foundations who are interested in funding certain things, that, being able to say, actually, don't fund me, fund those people over there directly, so that they're actually getting that direct funding, if foundation funding is what they want. Many kind of local organizations choose not to do foundation funding and or choose not to do state funding for a variety of kind of values-based reasons. Yeah, it's complicated. Read The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, and read it again and again and again.
Oh my God, that's perfect. I feel like you left us with action items, as many folks are, either systems folks or, working in the academic space or nonprofit space, and wondering, what do we do in these spaces to not only not do harm, but get out of the way so that we can build the future that we want. So I thank both of you so much for being here today and being in conversation with all of us. I'm forever indebted, and I feel like I've learned so much. So thank you so much to both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And just so as we close, I just want to say that we thank everyone who has been following the Up In. We're incredibly grateful for all of those who have joined with us, have challenged us, and who have been learning with us on this journey to abolish family policing. This webinar is the start of a series of conversations that will continue throughout the year, so we hope that you'll tune in for more. Our 1-year anniversary of launching Up In is June 18th, and at that point we will share something that we're really excited about that we've been working on, how we end up a future without family policing. How we end up is a set of ideas that we've been developing in collaboration with abolitionists and those impacted by the family policing system to help us move forward to a collective goal, a future without family policing, and especially a future where policing is not needed and children and families and communities thrive. So we look forward to continuing the conversation, to being in community with all of you, and thank you